All right, so um, we've got a lot to dig into today. This is going to be fun. You've given me a ton of crypto stuff to look at. We've got Bitcoin hitting new highs, and then you mentioned altcoins, so maybe this means it's going to be alt season.
Hmm.
And then there's this whole Flux.io thing. That sounds crazy.
Yeah.
Like a decentralized Amazon web services. I mean, really. Where do we even begin?
Yeah, it's a lot to cover for sure. It's what makes this space so interesting, right? Everyone's talking about the Bitcoin price, but to me, that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
The really interesting stuff is happening with projects like this, Flux.io you mentioned, especially in DeFi and Web3.
Hmm.
I think those areas are really going to take off if this Bitcoin rally keeps up.
That's really interesting. So one of the articles you sent me mentioned that Bitcoin just hit a new all-time high.
Yeah.
Over $67,000, which is
Hmm.
crazy. Honestly, I've never really gotten into Bitcoin myself, but I do know that when it goes up, it can bring the rest of the market with it.
Yeah, exactly. When Bitcoin goes up like this, it's like a signal to a lot of investors. They take their profits and then they look for the next opportunity. And that's usually where altcoins come in.
Yeah.
Especially the ones that have, good fundamentals and real-world use cases. Those are the ones that really benefit.
So it's like a chain reaction. Bitcoin goes up, people take profits, and then they put that money into altcoins.
Yeah.
Makes sense. And speaking of altcoins, one of the articles mentioned DeFi, decentralized finance. It seemed pretty optimistic about DeFi doing well with all this new interest in crypto.
Right. DeFi is going to be huge. It's like a whole parallel financial system.
Yeah.
Lending, borrowing, trading, all without the need for traditional banks.
Yeah.
And all that is built on the blockchain. So as more money flows into crypto, DeFi is going to benefit big time.
Okay, that makes sense, especially with all the distrust in the traditional financial system these days. But the article specifically called out Ethereum. Why is that? What makes Ethereum so important for DeFi? Are there any other altcoins we should be paying attention to?
So Ethereum is really the foundation for a lot of the DeFi and NFT space. It's the platform that a lot of these new projects are built on. Plus, they're working on some big upgrades to Ethereum to make it faster and more efficient. That's attracting a lot of new developers and users.
Okay, so Ethereum makes sense, but there are like thousands of altcoins out there. It's impossible to keep track of them all. What should people be looking for? How do you decide which projects are worth your time?
Yeah, it's definitely overwhelming. I would say look for projects that have real-world use cases. Things like gaming, decentralized storage, which actually brings us back to Flux.io, and data processing. These are all areas that are ripe for disruption, and that's where you'll find the most interesting projects.
Okay, let's talk more about Flux.io then. You said it's a decentralized cloud infrastructure provider, so is that like a decentralized version of Amazon Web Services?
Exactly. That's a good way to think about it. Flux is trying to offer an alternative to these big centralized cloud providers like Amazon, and they're doing it by using blockchain technology. The idea is that anyone can contribute computing power to the network, which in theory makes it more resilient and potentially cheaper and less prone to censorship because it's not controlled by one single company.
Wow. That's a really ambitious goal, to compete with a company as big as Amazon. Can they actually pull that off?
Well, it's definitely still early days for Flux, but the potential is there. As more companies start to prioritize decentralization, especially those that are concerned about things like data privacy, Flux could become a very attractive option.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a project to watch closely.
Okay, I'll keep an eye on it for sure. The article also mentioned this term Web3 as a driving force behind projects like Flux. Can you explain what Web3 is? I'm not sure I completely understand it.
Yeah, so Web3 is basically the next version of the internet. It's built on blockchain technology.
Yeah.
And the idea is that it's more decentralized, which means that the users have more control and ownership instead of everything being controlled by a few big companies. And to work properly, Web3 is going to need decentralized infrastructure, like what Flux is building.
It's amazing how all of these ideas are connected. Decentralized finance, decentralized storage,
Yeah.
decentralized cloud computing. It's like everything is moving in that direction. Before we go too far down the Web3 rabbit hole, though, I know you mentioned some other DeFi and Web3 projects that you've had your eye on. Anything else in particular?
Oh, yeah, there are a couple of others. So in DeFi, there are these lending protocols like Arav and Compound. They're becoming really popular because they offer an alternative to traditional lending. You can earn interest on your crypto by lending it out, and it's all transparent and decentralized.
So instead of putting your money in a savings account, you can lend it out directly to other people on these platforms. That's really interesting. But what about the risk? One of the articles you sent me talked about how DeFi platforms can be vulnerable to hacks and things like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the blockchain itself is very secure, but the smart contracts that these DeFi platforms are built on can sometimes have vulnerabilities. There have been cases where hackers have exploited these vulnerabilities and stolen a lot of money.
That sounds scary. So how do they try to prevent that? Are there any safeguards in place?
Well, for one thing, any reputable DeFi project is going to have its code audited by security experts to try to find and fix any vulnerabilities before they become a problem. And then there are also decentralized insurance protocols that are starting to pop up. So you can actually buy insurance to protect yourself against losses from these kinds of attacks.
Oh, wow. So it's like anything else. You have to do your research and understand the risks. But it's good to know that they're working on solutions to make it safer. It's really interesting. Okay, shifting gears a bit. One of the articles mentioned a couple of other projects, Filecoin and the Graph. They're doing decentralized storage and data stuff, right?
Yes,
All right.
exactly. Filecoin is like a decentralized version of Dropbox or Google Drive.
Mm.
It allows users to rent out their unused hard drive space to other users who need to store data. And it's all done on the blockchain, which makes it much more secure and resistant to censorship than using a centralized storage provider, and potentially cheaper too.
So it's like how Flex is taking on Amazon Web Services, but Filecoin is taking on companies like Dropbox and Google. That's fascinating. And what about the Graph? What do they do?
Yeah. The graph is really cool. It's like a decentralized Google for blockchain data. Essentially, it indexes all of the data on a blockchain and makes it easily searchable. So if you're building a DeFi application, for example, or an NFT marketplace, you can use the graph to quickly and easily access the data you need. It's a critical piece of infrastructure for the whole Web3 ecosystem.
So we've got decentralized storage with Filecoin, we've got decentralized data with the Graph, and we've got decentralized cloud computing with Flux. It's really starting to feel like a real alternative to the centralized internet is emerging here. But with all of this innovation, there have to be some challenges. What are some of the biggest hurdles that these projects are facing?
Yeah, there are definitely challenges. One of the big ones is regulation. Governments are still trying to figure out how to regulate this space.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of uncertainty about what the future holds, which can make it difficult for businesses to operate.
That makes sense. It's like the Wild West out there.
Right.
Right. So regulatory uncertainty is a big one. What else?
Scalability is another challenge. For blockchain technology to really achieve mass adoption, it needs to be able to handle a lot more transactions, much faster and cheaper than it can today. Especially for things like DeFi transaction fees, can be a real barrier to entry right now.
Yeah, I've heard about that. You mentioned earlier that Ethereum is working on some upgrades to address scalability. Are there any other projects doing that?
Yeah, there's a lot of work being done on what are called Layer 2 solutions. These are essentially separate blockchains that are built on top of existing blockchains, like Ethereum,
Yeah.
and they allow transactions to be processed much faster and cheaper because they don't have to go through the main blockchain. It's a very active area of development right now.
Okay, that's good to know. So a lot of smart people are working on solving these problems, which is reassuring. Speaking of Ethereum, though, one of the articles mentioned something about Ethereum switching to a proof-of-stake consensus mechanism. Can you refresh my memory on what that is and why is it important?
Sure. So proof of stake is a different way of securing a blockchain. Instead of using miners to validate transactions, like Bitcoin does, proof of stake uses validators, who are essentially just people who hold a certain amount of the cryptocurrency, and they stake their coins as collateral to guarantee their good behavior. It's much more energy efficient than proof of work, which is what Bitcoin uses. And it's also supposed to be more secure and scalable.
Interesting. So Ethereum is moving away from the whole mining thing. That's a pretty big change. Could that impact the price of Ethereum?
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
The success of Ethereum 2.0, which is what they're calling the upgrade to proof of stake, is going to be a big deal for the entire crypto space. If it works as well as they hope, it could make Ethereum much more attractive to both users and developers, which should drive up demand and price.
It's fascinating to see how all of this stuff is connected. The technology, the price, the adoption, it's all intertwined. But let's step back for a second and think about the average person who's just getting interested in crypto. It can be so overwhelming to know where to start. What advice would you give to someone who's completely new to this space?
Yeah, it can definitely be overwhelming. I would say the most important thing is to educate yourself. Don't just jump in blindly. Take some time to learn about how blockchain technology works, what different types of cryptocurrencies there are, and what DeFi and Web3 are all about. There are a ton of great resources available online. Websites like CoinDesk and Cointelegraph are good places to start. And of course, you can always listen to podcasts like this one.
We definitely encourage thorough research. So once someone has a basic understanding of things, what's the next step?
Well, then I would say it's time to start exploring the market. Open an account on a reputable cryptocurrency exchange. There are a lot of different options out there. So do your research and choose one that you're comfortable with. and then you can start investing.
Any tips on choosing what to invest in? That seems like the hardest part.
Yeah, for sure. It's important to diversify. Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah.
I would say a good starting point is to invest in Bitcoin and Ethereum, since they're the two largest and most established cryptocurrencies. And then once you're more comfortable, you can start branching out into some smaller altcoins or DeFi projects.
So start with the blue chips and
Yeah,
then maybe look into some of the riskier stuff once you know what you're doing.
exactly. Just remember to do your research.
Uh-huh.
And don't invest more than you can afford to lose.
Good advice. This has been incredibly helpful. It's amazing how much there is to learn about this space. It's complex, but it's also really exciting. It really is. I mean, we've covered so much ground already. It's clear that there's a ton of potential here, but also a lot of risk. What are some of the things that people should watch out for, especially newcomers who are just getting started in crypto?
Yeah, you definitely have to be careful. There are a lot of scams out there.
Yep.
Like with any new technology, people trying to take advantage of others. So you always want to do your research and be skeptical of anything that sounds too good to be true.
Are there any red flags that people should look out for? Like, how can you tell if something is a scam?
One thing I always tell people is to be wary of any project that promises guaranteed returns. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. You should also look for transparency. A legitimate project should have a white paper that explains their technology, their team, and their plans for the future. If they're not being upfront about that stuff, it's probably a bad sign.
So trust your gut. And if something feels off, it probably is. What else? What other mistakes do people make when they're first starting out?
Another big one is FOMO, fear of missing out. You see a coin going up in price and you don't want to miss out, so you buy in without doing your research. And then the price crashes and you lose a lot of money. It's really important to stay level-headed and not let your emotions get the best of you.
Easier said than done, especially with social media. Everyone's always talking about the next big thing.
Exactly. But you have to remember that it's your money, and you need to be in control of your investments. Don't let anyone else make decisions for you.
Solid advice. So we've talked a lot about the risks, but let's end on a positive note. What gets you most excited about this space? What are you most optimistic about for the future of crypto?
For me, it's really about the potential to create a more equitable financial system. Right now, there are billions of people around the world who don't have access to basic financial services. But with DeFi, that could all change. Anyone with a smartphone could have access to things like loans, savings accounts, and insurance, all without having to go through a traditional bank.
That's really powerful to be
Yeah.
able to empower people like that. And it's not just about finance either. We talked about Web3, this idea of a more decentralized internet, where users have more control over their data, their privacy. It's really exciting to think about the possibilities.
Absolutely. We're still in the early days. But I really do believe that we're on the verge of a technological revolution, one that has the potential to change the world in profound ways.
Well, I'm convinced this has been an incredible conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to break all of this down for me and for our listeners.
My pleasure. It's been fun.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening. We've talked about the potential of crypto, the risks, and the incredible impact it could have on the world. It's clear that this is much bigger than just money or technology. This is about shifting power back to the people and creating a more decentralized future. And for those who are willing to learn and explore, it's an incredibly exciting time to be involved. So keep learning, keep exploring, and as always, stay curious.